Hello. Hi, it's Rain. So today I want to explore and argue how child vampires are viewed as immoral, both by humans and within vampiric mythology, and represent not only a subversion of purity, but a subversion of nature. To begin, I want to differentiate between the two types of vampire children. The kind that were turned into vampires as kids, and the kind that were born vampire children. In this essay, I mostly want to focus on children turned into vampires because I think they represent more things on a larger scale than just children of vampires do. And I think there's more to examine and analyze on the topic. If vampires aim to subvert and corrupt purity, and in many cultures, children represent purity and innocence and naivete, then why is it considered bad within most vampiric communities, mythologically speaking, for children to be turned into vampires? One argument for this across many series is that it's cruel to condemn someone to an eternal life, but simultaneously leaving them incapable of navigating it effectively themselves. Another point brought up is that child vampires make the rest of the vampiric community much more vulnerable. In Interview with a Vampire, Claudia is entirely dependent on Louis and Lestat to take care of her because she was turned as a small child and she never learned the ability to protect herself on her own. The same with Eli in Let the Right One In. She relies on adult caregivers or, at certain points, human counterparts because she's unable to function as a normal human being, let alone as an adult. Another point brought up by Interview with a Vampire is the stagnancy that child vampires experience, wherein we see Claudia become more and more frustrated with her vampiric status and growing very tired of being a child forever when she sees people around her growing up and wishing that she could experience being an older version of herself. And the disconnect that comes with having a body that is very young, but having a mind that is continually growing and gaining new experiences.
Do you want me to be yourself forever? Can't I change like everybody else?
Furthermore to that is that vampire children grow and change in maturity and in terms of cognitive development over time, but their behavioral traits will never match their conscious age. Even if we're not just talking about the effects of being in a body and what that feels like, there are the ramifications of what if you're still throwing temper tantrums, but it's for really adult, complex emotional reasons. Again, with Claudia in Interview with a Vampire, I think is a really interesting character. We see her throwing tantrums and eventually, spoiler, murdering Lestat out of anger, unsuccessfully. But she has very reasonable, developed feelings to cause these outbursts. But again, she's only able to express them in fairly immature, childish ways. One interesting notion that I was kind of exploring earlier is that child vampires put a strain on the rest of the vampiric community because it makes them more vulnerable. It's easier for them to get caught, for people to see human beings helping vampires, and child vampires also usually have less self-control and therefore are able to conceal their vampiric identity less effectively than a developed adult vampire, which potentially sets the whole community at risk of being exposed, which isn't good for any of them. There are a lot of reasons why adult vampires wouldn't want there to be child vampires around. One question I was considering is whether or not child vampires not only represent a subversion of purity, but also a subversion of nature. For instance, if there's the idea that vampires are able to gain immortal life by feeding off of the lives of others, presumably through their blood, is there a line that justifies that, the cost of extended life of one creature with the shortened end of the life of another, but is it too far even for vampires if a child who is never able to fully develop is stunted forever? A simpler way of putting it is it justifiable to extend life unnaturally, but is it too far to prevent aging altogether? Another topic I find interesting when it comes to child vampires is if aspects of vampirism represent things, What does having a mind that doesn't align with your body represent about being a child vampire? In my understanding, I believe this could be analogous for experiencing traumatic events, such as how vampires often endure traumatic incidents that end up changing them into being a vampire, such as an intense assault, an attack, or a near-death experience. I would say that this is even more relevant for child vampires because not only is their life being interrupted and altered, but their innocence and aging is as well. Being turned into a vampire is something you will carry with you for the rest of your life. For child vampires, being turned in early childhood can represent trauma that they will carry and suffer the effects of for the rest of their life. With trauma stunting their development metaphorically and literally, it also goes to show that they will be stuck in a situation they don't have the tools to properly deal with for the rest of their lives. Child vampires perform a perversion of the essence of childhood, but also the role of protector over themselves, which they aren't able to consistently get from an adult figure because it was stolen from them when they turned. And if they do rely on human adults, it can make it very dangerous, and relying on other vampire adults makes them a vulnerability. I also wonder if the relationship of an adult vampire turning a child vampire and a child vampire in turn feeding off of others represents in some capacity the cycle of sexual abuse that can happen. If the children themselves survive being victims, do they need to become predators in order to avoid being prey? In a tragic way, I believe that they do. I think child vampires, it's important to acknowledge that whether born or created, but especially created, are a result of adult vampires not being able to control themselves. This goes along to expand my previous analysis of childhood vampire transformations as childhood trauma. Child vampires are subversions not only of purity and innocence, but of the roles between child and adult in both human and vampiric communities. So, after everything we've explored today, if child vampires are near universally considered bad, then why do they continue to appear in mythology? Well, child vampires continue to exist because of the selfishness of adult vampires. You often hear parents say, never grow up to their kids or baby because of the pain and growth that comes with a very quickly developing person you love very much and facilitating that person's life and growth. But imagine taking that to a new extent where you have the opportunity to keep alive and in the same state forever a surrogate child. For instance, in the case of Interview with a Vampire, he has the opportunity to save Claudia, who partially represents his own child that he lost in labor alongside his wife, but in this case he has the opportunity to interfere and keep her alive forever, at the cost of it being in a childlike state. Whether you consider it simple carelessness or a cruel, firm form of mercy, this leads to the notion of living for a parent, even mythologically speaking. Being a child vampire is a cruel and torturous experience. As for deliberate reproduction, I wonder what would happen if a vampire got a human pregnant. If a pregnant woman is turned, what happens to the unborn child? In the film Blade, that happens, and the child becomes a daywalker vampire. And similarly, in Twilight, a human woman is able to be inseminated with vampire genes, but is then eventually turned right when giving birth, and the child becomes a human vampire hybrid. I speculate that potentially there could also be the cases of stillborns or permanent fetuses that never develop past that stage, but can't exactly die through regular means either, or potentially just being born a vampire-human hybrid. The last thing I want to explore in today's video is in Dracula, there are metaphorical children of vampires as well as the notion of a child brain. So talking about children vampires, I think it's important to explore those two aspects as well, especially in the most famous piece of vampire literature ever. Quincy Harker is the child of Jonathan and Mina Harker, the protagonists of Dracula, and he's mentioned at the very end of the novel. Quincy Harker represents the restoration of natural order and rectification of gender roles and the reunion of what is good and right. The baby, though, is also read as the product of Harker and Dracula's mutual desire. This relation can be read as somewhat sexual, whether consensual or not, but what it is related to is the fact that Dracula has had metaphorical relations with both Mina and Jonathan. Therefore, in some strange way, it almost feels as though metaphorically, Dracula's death and contact with those two is tied to their bodies and then consequently the birth of their son. It's also implied by them in the end of the novel, once they've just killed Dracula, that Harker's spirit has gone into their bodies, holding him as he dies, and then is therefore reincarnated as their child, who they name after him. And so the child also is sort of the child of the group and represents the fruition of their efforts. But at the same time, they've just killed Dracula, and so it's thought that potentially his blood that has also been slain and shed could be the thing instead going in their bodies, which then creates the child that they name after their late friend. Quincy Harker is also potentially viewed as being the child of Dracula, as opposed to the child possessed by the spirit of their late friend. In Dracula, Van Helsing argues for something he calls child brain. He believes that children and criminals and vampires alike have what he characterizes as child brain. Returning to what is familiar when it's challenged, stuck in time when they return, being single-minded and obsessive, and are highly self-concerned. For instance, Dracula in life went to fight the Turks, and when something would go wrong, he would retreat back to his castle. For instance, when he is hunting Harker and friends, and it doesn't go so well in England, so he starts being hunted and he retreats back home. That's how they find him, and because he's single-minded and obsessive with those goals and tendencies, that is how Van Helsing determines a plan with the rest of the group to undermine him, catch, and then eventually kill Dracula, which is how in the end he is caught because of these habituations. So that's everything for today. Let me know if there's anything I left out or any other ideas you have or analyses regarding child vampires or adjacent topics we covered today. I just want to say thank you so much for your support, and I really hope that you guys enjoyed this. I'll be back again soon with another video, and hopefully you guys like talking about this kind of stuff as much as I do. So thank you. Have a good day. Bye.